Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. Prabha Kotiswaran. I'm Professor of Law and Social Justice here at King's College London, and I'm really delighted to welcome you all to the final conversation on social reproduction seminar for 2025. So over the past couple of months and in 2026, we will be sharing research from our project. Now, as many of you may know, over the past couple of months, several of us in the team, and I just happen to be presenting our work today, but actually the research behind the work that we are doing on cash transfers draws on a rather large interdisciplinary group. And some of my colleagues are here and some are not able to be here, but I just wanted to share that this is a large collective enterprise. And we have been working on unconditional cash transfers to women in India, and we look forward to sharing some of our research with you on this. So before I go into today's seminar, I want to welcome our discussant, Professor Kalpana K, who has very graciously agreed to join us today to comment on our research, which is focusing on Tamil Nadu. And Professor Kalpana is Associate Professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Madras. And she's an expert on development studies, and she has worked extensively on gender and development, on microfinance, on self-help groups, and looked at state-sponsored livelihood and poverty alleviation initiatives. And she's the author of a 2017 book from Rutledge called Women, Microfinance and the State in Neoliberal India. She's also the author most recently of a 2025 book, which I believe is being discussed in many places, and it looks absolutely amazing. It's called A Woman of No Consequence, Memory, Letters, and Resistance in Madras, published by Westland Books. So we are really delighted, Professor Kalpana, for to have you with us and to engage with our research. So as I mentioned earlier, we've been working on unconditional cash transfers through an explicitly gendered and feminist lens. And obviously the current debate on cash transfers to women in India is very much mired in discussions around electoral outcomes and how these quote unquote freebies are really being instrumentalized to derive votes from women in exchange for some form of money, either in the form of cash transfer schemes or, as we saw most recently in Bihar, a lump sum amount as part of a livelihood generation scheme. So, of course, we want to extricate the debate from purely the electoral dynamics and think about it more broadly as a political opportunity for feminists to push through certain key demands of the Indian women's movement, which have materialized over several years and are now also being recast through the lens of investments in the care economy. So, and as part of this research, we've also published a policy brief co-authored by myself and my colleagues, Gail Andrew and Dr. Madhushree Jana. And this is available on our website. And this actually offers an overview of the schemes across the 12 states that have implemented them. And what are the terms on which they have been implemented? What is the impact, evidence of impact so far that has been generated? And essentially how we can make this gender transformative. That's what we are very keen to push through. And we really welcome your thoughts and comments as part of this endeavor. So what I'll be doing today is really sharing some insights from our report, which is also available on our website. And it's called A Right to Care, A Right to Welfare. And it's a study of the Kalaignar Mahalir Urimai Thittam, which is the unconditional cash transfer scheme to women in the state of Tamil Nadu. So now, obviously, the way we're looking at these cash transfers is to think of them as offering recognition of women's unpaid care and domestic work, as well as unpaid economic activity, as well as underpaid paid employment. And some states state this explicitly, and some states assume it implicitly. But we are very focused on what this might mean in terms of economic recognition of women's work, whether unpaid or paid. And of course, there are many feminist priors to these demands of the state. And very quickly, I would mention the Wages for Housework campaign of the 1970s, as we are all familiar with, where the idea was to really think about, how could you put a price on the value of unpaid domestic and care work, which generates surplus value for the capitalists, in order to then refuse housework. So really, it's being thought of more as wages for and against housework. And in India, in the 30s itself, Indian feminist nationalists advocated for the economic recognition of women's unpaid work through a range of rather creative policy measures, which haven't materialized so far. But certainly the state in 2011 at the center thought about a proposal for recognizing women's unpaid work. And elsewhere, I've written what I call the wages for housework jurisprudence of Indian appellate courts, whereby in motor vehicles accident cases where the homemaker or the woman died, courts essentially held that her unpaid work was on par with an occupation, that therefore there should be economic recognition of it, and that a sizable amount of compensation should be paid, typically by the insurance company, to the descendants or the dependents of the woman. So this is quite a robust jurisprudence, which has since been applied not only to deceased homemakers, but also homemakers who are alive, but who are disabled, as well as other people who are engaged in the informal economy. Now, the Supreme Court of India, at least on 2 occasions, has reiterated in the context of this jurisprudence that economic recognition of women's unpaid work is a constitutional obligation with a view to ensuring gender equality. So we have this recognition in Indian law as of now. Now, there are some debates, certainly, and it's quite interesting that we're discussing Tamil Nadu because most recently in 2021, Tamil Nadu was the state where Kamal Hassan made, quote unquote, the promise of salaries for housewives. And this initiated a rather robust feminist debate on cash transfers. And so it's interesting to revisit that debate today in 2025 and on the eve of another election in Tamil Nadu in 2026. So there are many feminist arguments which came up against cash transfers at that point and for cash transfers. And all of these are included in our policy brief on cash transfers. So I'll just highlight some of the key arguments. Of course, the argument is that women may actually not have control over the money. Men would. Therefore, cash transfers won't benefit women, that they reinforce the gender division of labor, that they might disincentivize paid work or investments in education. And that worse still, it could actually mean the elimination of investment in public infrastructure. And of course, that it won't be fiscally sustainable in the long run. And of course, we also have experts on welfare like Yamini Iyer who have argued that this is nothing more than a form of what she calls techno-patrimonial welfarism, right? Which entrenches the personalized politics of various political leaders. Now, in terms of arguments for cash transfers, and here, of course, there is a huge literature in development economics, which I won't really touch on, but certainly in the context of India, some arguments were made for cash transfers to show that actually they would promote women's financial inclusion and literacy, they could increase their economic bargaining power, that in fact it would not disincentivize paid employment or education. It might in fact even put boundaries on unpaid work and disrupt the gender division of labor, and that it doesn't actually mean that you cannot continue to invest in public services and social protection policies. And over time, as political leaders have implemented cash transfers in their states, they've also added some arguments to this, which appear to me to be feminist. So, for example, in the state of Jharkhand, the chief minister said that it reduces malnutrition, it reduces distress migration and trafficking and bonded labor, and has some important environmental outcomes. And then, of course, there is a issue of how this does cut out political intermediation. So the money goes directly to the bank accounts of women. And given that a lot of these cash transfers came up on the back of the pandemic, certainly there was an argument that it provides a demand-side stimulus to the economy. So what we thought then was to, of course, we need some evidence of how these cash transfers have actually been implemented and what is the impact. And obviously, it is too soon to say definitively what the impact is, but we thought that we could begin to collect some evidence, especially because states have not had any baseline data before they rolled out the schemes at great speed. So in the context of Tamil Nadu itself, as we all know, all political parties uh, promised these cash transfers after Kamal Hassan's promise, and the DMK came to power, and it took them 2 years, almost 2.5 years, to actually roll out the KMUT scheme. And very briefly, it gives women 1,000 rupees per month. It's given to the female head of eligible households. The woman needs to be at least 21 years of age, have a ration card, an annual household income of less than 2.5 lakhs, and less than a certain amount of land ownership and electricity consumption at the household level. And it includes women headed households. So single women are within this within the net of the scheme, but there are exclusion criteria around taxpayers, government employees, elected representatives, vehicle owners, as well as women receiving other social security schemes in the state. And only one woman in each household receives the benefit. And as of February 2025, there were 11.4 million women who were receiving this. So what did we do? I mean, as part of our project, what we thought was we would engage in a mixed methods approach. We started off doing some qualitative research at the 6-month mark to look at how women were receiving the cash transfer. And this informed the creation of our survey tool. And then at the 1-year mark, since the rollout of the scheme, we conducted a survey of 2,200 women. And we then followed this up with post-survey qualitative research to, fine tune some of the insights from the survey and follow this up with women themselves. So as you can see, what we did was we divided the respondents into women who are receiving the scheme and women who are not receiving the scheme. And so therefore you see beneficiaries who are women receiving the scheme, who we refer to as the treatment group, and the non-beneficiaries that we refer to as the control group. And we have control as well as treatment districts, and that's what I've indicated in the methodology. Now, the qualitative work that was part of the research at the 6-month mark has been published in a journal article, and some of the insights that are shared in the article were endorsed in the survey. We found the same results in the survey, so I'll just go over some of these insights. One was that KMUT was viewed as a different kind of money, different from the money that women got from the husband. Women received the money regularly and with tremendous certainty on the 15th and 16th of every month. They recognized the fact that the scheme's name was formulated in terms of women's rights. Most women did not understand the purpose of the scheme. A very small percentage recognized that it was for their unpaid work. And here I just want to say that Tamil Nadu is a rare state in the sense that the government notification very clearly acknowledges that the cash transfer is for women's unpaid domestic and care work, as well as underpaid paid work. So it's a very well-written notification. So you would think that the goal of the scheme somehow would also carry through to the ground, but as in the case of many schemes, it didn't. And women did sense that this was compensating for underpaid employment, and they grasped the idea of a compensatory state to the extent that the state wasn't creating enough jobs, and therefore they were giving them this money. We found that women had complete control over the money. They reported peace, dignity, freedom, pride, and respect in various ways. There were indications that it disturbed the transactional nature of marriage in some instances because they felt that this was money they were bringing into the marriage. There was reporting of less household conflict. By this, I mean low-level bickering over money. Women felt respected as rights bearers. However, when we asked them what they wanted, jobs or cash, women overwhelmingly wanted jobs. Interestingly, also, they wanted all women to get the money, irrespective of their age, irrespective of whether they had the necessary documentation, and irrespective of wealth, because they felt that even wealthy women actually had no access to money and that therefore they should have the scheme. And they were keen to disrupt the gender division of labor. And importantly, they wanted decent work in villages close to them, and they wanted decent work for men. They wanted labor laws to be implemented, as well as for them to have 150 days of Manrega work. So now going on to some of the results from this survey, a very large percentage of the respondents belong to most backward classes, and scheduled castes. And predominantly our sample was rural, and this was intentional because we wanted to see how far this money would actually go, because there is the sense that these amounts are very small, they're almost meaningless. We also found that most of the families were nuclear with 4 or less members. Now, in terms of the socioeconomic profile, again, more women in the treatment group engaged in paid work than the control group. We also find the kinds of occupations that they engaged in, where a very large percentage of them engaged in non-agricultural labor, followed by agricultural labor, and then a whole range of other occupations. We also found that, in terms of the income and expenditure of the two groups, we found that the treatment group was earning about 11,000 rupees per month and was spending it more or less. And the control group was earning 14,000 rupees and was more or less spending the exact amount. And we found a very large percentage of both groups having BPL cards. And in terms of access to the scheme, we found that most of them found it very easy to register for the scheme, although they did need help in the registration process. When it comes to how women felt about receiving the amount, overwhelmingly they were extremely pleased with the receipt of the money. And in terms of financial inclusion, a very large percentage, about 96%, already had bank accounts before the rollout of the scheme. About 2/3 of the treatment group had an ATM card. About 2/3 owned a phone, of which 50% were smartphones. Again, about 60% could read the SMS messages, and 90% planned their expenditure in anticipation of the scheme amount. And 99% of them received the full amount on time. So this is very, very key, because when you look at other states, this may not necessarily be the case. But in Tamil Nadu, the scheme was actually implemented the way it was meant to be. And 99% reported control over the entire money. And obviously, this is just a snapshot of the data. There's a lot of other data points which, we're not entirely able to share here, but this is just some of the key takeaways. Again, going to the question of the perception of the purpose of this scheme, about half of them thought it was for the household, about 1/3 thought it was for them. And then a very small sliver thought that it was for women's empowerment and in acknowledgement of their unpaid work. And in terms of their perception of this scheme, this is not the actual impact, but their perception of this scheme, a very large percentage of them, about higher than 80%, thought it enabled entry into paid work or increased access to paid work or improved the efficiency of existing paid work. When it came to the gender division of labor, about 7% thought that it reinforced the gender division of labor, and very minuscule number thought that it prevented paid work or education. Now, in terms of the impact of the scheme, and here again, I don't have my economist colleagues with me, unfortunately, today, but they designed the methodology for data analysis and used econometric methods of propensity score matching and entropy balancing to really, look at both the treatment group and the control group to see what the impact of the scheme was on these 6 outcome indicators. And I just want to again mention here that because there was no baseline data, we had to make the assumption that both groups were on par with each other before the rollout of the scheme. Now, going on to these indicators, we find that in terms of the household spending, the treatment group was 20 percentage points more likely to spend on medicines, much less likely to spend on loans and SG loan repayments, and also far less likely to spend the money on themselves. In terms of food consumption, we had several questions asking them about various food groups, about the number of meals that they consumed on a daily basis. We asked about food consumption and consumption at the household level as well as at the individual level. And we found that, when it came to household food consumption, there was an increase in the consumption of fish and eggs. So 19 percentage points were more likely to consume fish and 8 percentage points more likely to consume eggs. And you also find sort of, the frequency of the consumption of these foods as well. We find an increase in the frequency of consuming fish. We also find, propensity to consume aerated drinks as well as fried foods, which I understand from the literature is not uncommon when people get cash transfers. So this was not unusual, but we also found this during our fieldwork. And when we look at, again, the meals that they consume, beneficiaries were slightly less likely to have certain meals. And when we look at the beneficiaries' own consumption, it mirrors the consumption patterns of the household in terms of more likely to consume fish and the frequency as well, but also more likely to consume fried foods and aerated drinks and less likely to consume other healthier food groups. Now, in terms of financial inclusion and well-being, I think this is where we saw the most difference between the two groups. You find far more engagement of the women receiving the amount in terms of their ability to, read the passbook, withdraw money, be aware about banks, visit the banks physically, as well as have access to banking services. But of course, given, the profile of these households, they were less likely to save the money or to make investments. And significantly, I think in the qualitative work, one of the things that we found was the receipt of the money produce dignitary outcomes, which were really key. So we felt like we should probe this further in the survey itself. And so here we have some parameters. So here we are actually not comparing the two groups. We're just talking about the beneficiaries' perception. And we find very high levels of financial well-being in terms of their autonomy, in terms of spending money without permission from the husband, relief from economic stress, feeling like an asset instead of a liability, and increased self-confidence to handle life situations. And when we compare the two groups, again, we find that there's a significant difference between the two groups in terms of their financial well-being, in terms of these 4 parameters. Now, coming on to women's paid and unpaid work, this is, of course, this is the holy grail for, I think, feminist economists, and I'm glad there are some of you with us today, because this is actually quite difficult to unpack. And we found that more beneficiaries were likely anyway to engage in paid work outside the home, but we also asked questions around paid work inside the home. And we see that there are some differences between the two groups, and with the treatment group doing more work outside the home, but also within the home, as well as on unpaid work within the home that was generating income. Now, we also interrogated a group of, a subset of the entire sample. We asked them again as a follow-up survey to go through 22 categories of unpaid work to actually see if there was an increase or decrease in the kind of time that they were spending on various forms of unpaid work. And we do find that the treatment group was spending more time on taking care of children and elders, less time on, cleaning the house and domestic work, and more time on agriculture on their own land, but also more time on, gathering firewood, weaving and tailoring. So we found some differences between the two groups here. Then in terms of inter-household bargaining power, we asked a range of questions, but we found differences in these two categories, which is interestingly decisions regarding the husband's money, as well as the husband's trust in how the wife used money. And finally, conflict and violence. This was, again, a somewhat difficult set of data to really pass through. So we certainly found decrease in daily conflict. But when we looked at various forms of minor and major violence, we did find that there was a subsection of the sample where, when we compared the two groups, there was an increase in certain forms of minor violence. as well as major violence. So in terms of pushing the wife or the frequency, both the incidents as well as the nature of the violence. Women also hit their husbands. This was unprovoked, so we find an increase there as well. And we also find an increase in sexual violence. Also, the numbers are very low within the sample size, but we did find this as well. And also an increased consumption of alcohol by husbands, but a decreased frequency at which husbands were asking women for money for alcohol. So now coming on to the recommendations, we asked women themselves what they thought about the scheme. And this is really important because I think in a lot of countries, despite good intentions in terms of rolling out these transfers for women's empowerment, uh, integrating feminists or women's groups or women themselves who are beneficiaries of these schemes is rather minimalist. So we were very keen to make sure that women have voice in the way that these schemes are being designed and implemented. So here we find, 2/3 of the women saying they wanted an increase in the amount, 17% saying keep it the same, and 42% saying stop the payments and give us jobs. Interestingly, 31% said, include all women. And again, there is some information we have on how women thought that, there were other wealthier women who felt quite disheartened when the 15th or the 16th came because they didn't get this money and they didn't have control over the household wealth or income. And similarly, when we asked about whether they wanted the cash transfer, the job, or both, we find a larger number wanting jobs, some wanting both, about 23%, and some wanting only the cash transfer. And this maps out, I think, in terms of the age of the women, the older women and the women with smaller children wanting only the cash transfer, and women who are in the working age category wanting to work, and some wanting both because they had no confidence in the ability of the state to provide jobs. So we find this. And of course, Tamil Nadu also has the dynamic around migration. So some women also thought that with the influx, especially in the big cities, with the influx of migrants, they had less of a chance of getting jobs. Now, in terms of our recommendations, we believe that given that Tamil Nadu has this idea that the scheme is for the recognition of women's unpaid work, more could be done in terms of messaging around the recognition of unpaid work, but also, of course, measures for reduction and redistribution. And of course, feminists have written about this extensively. And I think all of the proposals that feminists have made should be pursued here in the state. There is a need to undertake an audit of the welfare regime from a feminist perspective. We believe there's a need to embed the KMUT in a right to care law. And I think international experiences show that this is really important because if it's just at the level of policy and it's rolled back, it undermines solidarity between women. And women themselves that we met have this understanding that the government is doing a lot to improve women's rights and equality. So there is already that consciousness, which I think can be built upon, and definitely the need to improve care infrastructure and to deliver financial literacy and basic literacy as well in terms of numeracy and literacy. And of course, the involvement of gender experts at every stage of the scheme implementation. And also need to amplify some of the empowerment effects that we saw. 33% said they could make demands of political representatives or mobilize against violence against women. Now, of course, in terms of microfinance institutions, there was a lot of pain that the women felt in terms of the predatory practices of MFIs. And, there were times when my colleagues conducted FGDs, Rebecca, Hannah, and Priya, who are not with us here today, but they did extensive fieldwork. And they found that there were women who couldn't even speak at the FGD because they were so worried about the debt. And there's more details on this in the report, the amount of the loans and so on. And of course, this won't come as a surprise to us, but there is a real need to regulate MFIs in this context. And of course, in terms of health, interestingly, for a state like Tamil Nadu, we found that there was much more that needs to be done on the health front. I mean, there is, of course, the messaging on a healthy diet, which I think is required around the country. But we also found gaps in public health care because many were taking loans for medical expenses. There was also corruption in public health sector. And again, 96% of women, whether treatment or control, wanted the TASMAC shops to be closed. And this was really, I mean, women understand completely, and men understand too. The men would, of course, berate them to say that it was because of their liquor that they were getting these schemes. And the women also felt that, maybe the shop should simply be shut down, and this would really improve the quality of their lives. So we essentially think that there is a range of recommendations that could be implemented in the short term, in the medium term, and in the long term. And I will stop here and hand over to Kalpana. But of course, our reports are all on our website, both the policy brief as well as the report on Tamil Nadu itself. Thank you. Over to you, Kalpana.
I hope everybody can hear me. I hope I've unmuted myself, and I hope I'm visible as well as audible. So, yeah, I have about four major points that I sort of wanted to organize my responses around, and reiterating much of what you have already put on the table before us, Prabha. I want to start by saying that primarily why it is that feminist scholars, researchers, and activists have been excited about this scheme in Tamil Nadu is not that it was conditional or unconditional, that debate about, but for the first time you actually have a recognition of women's unpaid and domestic care work. And in fact, and that is the rationale of the scheme, like you rightly said, the notification makes it very explicit. It leaves nothing to the imagination that this is, what the scheme is about, and this is why the scheme has even been conceived in the first place. And you have given us a brief, I sort of also want to add a little bit to that history, that little flashback that you gave us, when actually it was interesting that when the scheme was first mentioned, it was in the manifesto, not of the DMK, the ruling party, but of a new entrant in the electoral fray, and that was the popular Tamil actor Kamal Hassan, who wanted this eyeball grabbing sort of move. And he made that in his manifesto by saying, and he used these words, that if his government came to power, then they would acknowledge and monetize women's unpaid labor. And so that was, and this came like a shot out of the blue because nothing had quite prepared us for this. And that was exactly like you said, a political opportunity for feminists like me to use that space, to see it as an invitation, an opening to have a conversation about issues of gender and unpaid care labor. And I remember I responded by writing an op-ed piece for our national newspaper, The Hindu, both in English and for the Tamil Hindu, doing exactly what you said just now, which is reminding readers that there's a history to this demand. It was part of the second wave in North America and Europe, and it was called the wages for housework debate, and the pros and the cons of the debate, who was on this side, who was on the other side. For me, it was a tremendously exciting moment because it meant for the first time that a wider public was sort of engaging with these ideas. At the same time, I must say that this has been implemented, as your report also suggests, essentially as a basic income scheme with these connotations of redistributing or recognizing unpaid care labor, but none of that. There has been no public messaging ever since the scheme was implemented around the significance of women's unpaid work. In fact, it has, and I think that's what also comes through. Only 4% of the sample that you interviewed believed that the scheme had anything at all to do with women's household labor. And it's generally seen as a poverty alleviation scheme. And in Tamil Nadu as well, apart from this is, of course, a hugely successful women-targeted poverty alleviation scheme. That's the perception. And the other scheme, which is sort of matches this in popularity, is the free public transport on the government-run buses that is offered to women. So that's really part of the DMK's overture towards cultivating women as an electoral constituency, with much of the radical import around the scheme being completely lost. So once again, then for feminist researchers like us, this whole, how do you get women also to think differently around introducing the work they do? Very often women keep saying, what do you do? I do nothing at all. Na summa da irukken. I'm just at home, just sitting around at home, right? Which is their way of saying that I'm not engaging in paid work, right? So there has been really no shift at all, no paradigm shift or any other kind of shift around, reworking the social contract, or even making it clear that this work is not an extension of women's innate nature, but is actually real work, right? And that this is subsidizing the formal monetized economy. So I would see that as an opportunity that we have lost in the implementation of the scheme. And it was interesting that your report very briefly mentions that you have developed a toolkit for middle school children that does just this, essentially create a conversation around care work and the significance of care work. And I was also thinking of ways, and this is something I also keep reiterating when I speak to different audiences in Tamil Nadu, which is why is it that our MLAs, our chief ministers, and we all know that the cabinet is almost all male, why is it that none of them issue public statements around this scheme, which sort of emphasize what the scheme is all about? Instead of that, we have this image of, well, Chief Minister Stalin's wife, Durga Stalin, who is, through her public statements and interviews, projects herself as the homemaking woman behind the man, right? And all of her public messaging, her self-representation is that of a woman who innately performs these tasks because, well, that's what women do, that's what women have always done. So this is not a critique of Durga Stalin as much as it is a way of saying that none of this consciousness has percolated to any segment of our political class. So I'm just going to begin on that pessimistic note, but then move on to say that, and this is my second point, that of course, I think your report captures the practical utility of the scheme for income poor women from rural and urban Tamil Nadu. There's no denying that at all. I'm not at all surprised that your report finds that it enables household consumption smoothing. That's the literature that we use in microfinance, and that given that women are eating better, spending on fish and vegetables, buying medicine, buying gas cylinders, and as, of course, you say, well, they don't spend as much on loan repayment, but we know that cash is fungible and it's extremely hard to keep track of exactly how cash is used. So if money is used for this, then it's possible that it's freeing up other sources of household income for loan repayment as well. And no, I think that's important because we have other studies in Tamil Nadu that are also showing that women's contribution to household debt is significantly higher than their contribution to household income. So women borrowers get into debt which is 9 times their annual income when compared to, say, men, and their debt is 3 times their annual income, right? So there's really a lesson for us there. And in my own field work in Tamil Nadu as well as in Kerala, I find that women constantly speak of and use the word rolling, right? So rolling has become a word that is really a part of both Malayalam and Tamil now. It's an essential strategy for household survival, and what women mean is that they're constantly juggling cash around, borrowing from there, repaying this, using this to repay the money lender, etc. And essentially, it is a way of talking about women's emotional, physical labor and the enormous psychological strain that women undergo. And I think your report captures that when you talk about the MFIs in Tamil Nadu as well. Now, it's not, obviously, it is not a situation that women should be in. It's far from ideal. And it's so one way to situate this scheme, the Kalaignar Mahalir Urimai Thittam, in the context of the Dravidian model of Tamil Nadu, is to see it as one in this sort of array of social protection schemes or welfare schemes that have been regularly rolled out targeting women, right? And both the DMK and the ADMK, as we know, have competed with each other in doing this. And this cash transfer is one of that. It belongs there, and by targeting women, it sort of, also acknowledges really what Sylvia Chant says is not the feminization of poverty, but the feminization of the labor and time input that women invest in keeping households surviving, in keeping households afloat. The burden to cope is essentially to cope with poverty has become women's burden to cope with poverty. And this is where we can situate and place what this scheme is doing. And yes, of course, I agree with you. And it's not surprising that it is not discouraging, that you find that the scheme is not discouraging women from engaging in paid work. It can't possibly do that. It's this tiny amount of money. It's just about barely 11.1 US dollars. And on the other hand, I thought it was very interesting. Your case studies show that it allows women to pay the auto fare to get to their work site. It allows them to buy their sons petrol so they can get dropped off in their work site, or to buy batter, etc. So in a way, it is enabling income generation within the household and outside the household as well. And I think, therefore, the large question that still confronts us is what is keeping women back from paid work, even keeping in mind that Tamil Nadu's labor force participation figures are higher than the national average. There is, and I can also say this from my own field work in North Chennai and other parts of Tamil Nadu, there is a tremendous hunger for employment amongst women of working class families, subject, of course, to constraints. Women are saying that they want jobs close enough to their homes, as they are acknowledging that they are going to continue to be embedded within care work in the foreseeable future. So their mobility is going to be limited. They are really not free to sell their labor power, right? And that's what they're telling us, which means, and also then the larger question is, but jobs are not growing in the sectors that employ women, because there's enormous gendered occupational segregation. So where are the jobs in the sectors where women are traditionally employed? And these are the large questions that continue to stare us in the face. Yeah, so I'm saying that that's really not being resolved, addressed, or even worsened by this scheme. The fourth point really is, and this is again very interesting, that some women were saying, why should there be a poverty criteria at all? What about women in more comfortable, economically comfortable households where there is actually, and I think what they're saying quite explicitly is that there is intra-household inequality, there is intra-household ill-being. And they're talking about the distribution and allocation of resources within the household and men's tendency to monopolize resources. It's very interesting that this has come up in your findings. And this, I think, reminds us again of Cecile Jackson's paper about nearly 20 years or 25 years ago, when she says that what we need to do perhaps is to rescue gender from the poverty trap. That we need to acknowledge, all practitioners of gender and development, that the relations, the structural relations of disadvantage that constitute gender inequality may not and do not always overlap with those that constitute poverty. And it therefore means that these are two distinctive agendas: gender justice and poverty alleviation. They must not be conflated with each other. And therefore, not all gender redistributive efforts need to be targeted to women living in poverty or women living below the poverty line either. And I think these are the important lessons that we sort of we need to keep in mind. So when she says, let's retrieve gender from the poverty trap, we need to perhaps rescue the Kalaignar Mahalir Thittam from the poverty trap in Tamil Nadu, where it's firmly lodged. And in terms of the elections ahead, I agree with you. It's likely perhaps, once again, given the competitive landscape that we have, perhaps it's likely to remain 1,000, perhaps it's likely to become 1,500 or 2,000 in the manifestos of either of our political parties. But it's very difficult to sort of think of how any political party is going to be invested in reimagining the social relationships within the household economy, right? I'm just going to finish by suggesting something here that I've said often when I talk about this scheme. While I quite understand why, Mahalir Urimai Thittam is rights, right? So essentially saying it's not welfare, it's not a dole, it's not charity, you are entitled to receive this. Well, that's good. That's a good step, but why not just call it Urimai Thittam, which is labor, as a way of saying that this is acknowledgement of labor that women are constantly performing, and perhaps that little change can also push the needle forward on that important conversation that we seem to be getting nowhere close to having. So finally, congratulations on your study and its very important findings, Prabha and Gail and others. And I look forward to more conversations.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much, Kalpana. Yeah, I think we have time for Q&A, and I hope you will make this point, of course, in the lead up to the elections. If there is some movement within Tamil Nadu to influence political parties, feminist initiatives, that would be very welcome if you could spearhead that. And yeah, I think we can open it up now to any other comments that others have. Yeah, go ahead, Divya.
Thank you, ma'am. I am Divya. I'm doing my PhD at the Department of Political Science, Delhi University. While doing my field work in Tamil Nadu on temple entry movements, that was a time when this information was circulating amongst people that soon the government will be coming up with a Urimai Thittam for women. So when Kalpana ma'am talked about Urimai Thittam, there were many women who said that we are glad that it is not an illavasam, it's not a freebie to us, it's not a salugai, not a subsidy or a concession to us, it's Urimai. So the naming of the scheme itself, Urimai, recognizing a woman's uh, labor, her identity, her effort itself, that the naming itself was interesting to them at that time. So when there are men who intervened and said that in just like that only the government is giving it to you, what use of it is to you anyways, you're not earning anything for it, but the women said that the naming itself says it's for Urimai, so you cannot question us. It's not an illavasam, it is not a Kalagai, not a concession, not a freebie, so don't you dare question us on that. Okay, and because state was sanctioning it, they felt more emboldened by that naming itself. So this was a discussion that was going on, so I felt like sharing that observation from my field. Thank you. Thank you.
Very useful, Divya. That's really great to hear, right? Like how people are imagining the scheme. So I think Professor Rao, please go ahead.
Yeah. Thanks, Prabha. You don't have to be very formal. That was really an interesting presentation, and thanks, Kalpana, also for your comments. I mean, I found it very interesting in this whole thing on looking at cash transfers, that what's kind of really struck out to me was, which is again both old issues, the TASMAC and the alcohol issue is very closely linked to women's control over income, and the other one is, of course, the MFIs and totally, the indebtedness issue, which Kalpana also mentioned. And I think, this is a very, I think this takes you into a slightly different, very political domain, because liquor, of course, has been, right from the time of Kalaignar, was basically the liquor was introduced to pay for the midday meal scheme. And because they were not getting money from the center. So I think there is it raises to me that these two issues coming out so strongly, it actually becomes a slightly larger issue than maybe. I mean, the states definitely should do it, and of course now states are competing with each other for 1,000, 10,000, 3,000, from an election gimmick perspective. But it just bothers me a little bit that, on the larger political economy kind of scale, that somehow, women's work burdens are actually totally get used in this whole process of, fundraising because of center state relations and fundraising by states and not. I saw recently also in the newspaper, there was something, I think one of the states, whether it was Tamil Nadu or Kerala, actually commented that without getting money from the center, they cannot run schemes and so on. But there was a second issue. So I think this is a very deep and long-standing problem, which is showing up in your study as well. But I think the other thing is that given that there is a competition for cash transfers, whether it's a political gimmick or whatever it is. I mean, I'm just thinking aloud here, Kalpana, that whether one way is to actually link it in some way to women's work and wages, because this 1,000 is not linked to anything. It's basically a welfare. I mean, if you say that, okay, this is to recompensate women for minimum wages. So if you take minimum wages of, 200 or 250 rupees a day or whatever for unskilled work, then, then your compensation, if you're really doing that, then your compensation should be whatever, 7,500. If you say 200 rupees a day, then it should be 6,000 rupees a month. The 1,000 doesn't sit anywhere. So I'm just thinking that, if it's just a welfare transfer for women's status, and I get all those points which were very interesting that they came out in your survey, Prabha, that women really feel so good that they are getting this money and they feel like rights holders and they feel the government is recognizing. I think that recognition is a very important part of justice. So I thought that that's very valuable. But how do we take this issue? If you want to bargain or if you want to influence states, what exactly should the recommendation be? Should it be to actually recognize that this work is worth a lot more? Therefore, if we do want to give something, give a decent amount. Similar to the maternity benefits, right, which Tamil Nadu was very successful with. That if you really want maternity benefit to be like at least 3 months for women, like leave for the informal sector women, then this 5,000 is useless. It has to be 18,000. So I think for me, what I'm not getting is, what's the rationale? If it's just a recognition step, that's also fine. But, if we are arguing something else, then what's the rationale that should be used? You need not necessarily answer just now, but as I was listening to this, it kept coming in my mind that how do you really confront this issue? Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
It's really valuable. Kalpana, did you want to?
Now, I was just thinking that when Kamal Hassan first introduced the scheme in his manifesto, it was 3,000, a monthly 3,000. And then, of course, people were saying, well, he can say anything because he's not going to come to power in the state. So he can promise women the moon. Yeah, that's right. That if you were to, if it was really about compensating women for either badly paid work or employment they're not getting, and valuing the work that they're actually already performing within the household, then it's got to be something of the at least 5,000 to 7,000. And there's a way in which we can insist, we can use this as a bargaining tool, I suppose, but I'm just wondering where it's going to get us in this world of real politics, right? I'm just sort of wondering what it is going to take for us to push governments to invest time, energy, and just creative resources in shifting the public messaging around the scheme from where it is today.
And Kalpana, just to put it back to you, like if you take the Bihar example from the recent elections,
yeah.
But the scary part of that is, like you're giving 10,000, which is already in the bank accounts of these women, but actually you will have to cut down on public services, right? Like health. Where is this money going to come from? So the big risk is that the enabling environment, what we have always fought for, that even if women have to work, they need the childcare, they need the creches, they need the health services, they need good education services, regular midday meals. When you talked about undernutrition or malnutrition, Prabha, but the thing is that none of the midday meals have enough budget for a healthy meal, which is a big meal for the child, because they're so poorly funded. So I think that I don't have any answers. That's why I just found it stimulating. So I've just posed this thing about also the trade-offs with the larger political economy of what the state is supposed to do for the citizens.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And the role that the taskmat plays here again, because in fact, women in SAGs often say, you don't have to give us anything, just shut
Just
down
shut it down. Yeah.
shops, because anything that you give us is sort of being drained out.
Hmm.
And the reason that we are bearing this responsibility is that our husbands have been rendered useless by the state distribution of liquor, useless as male providers, as household
Yeah.
providers.
Yeah.
And that's again a question that we don't have, and no government is willing to sort of kill the goose that lays the golden eggs.
Yeah.
So there's the big thing, and that's why I also found it very interesting, Prabha, that you found that 56% of the women said, just give us employment, give us jobs. We don't even want cash transfers, right? So give us the means to earn our own livelihood. And obviously the other things they are perhaps also saying, get out of the house, our social universe expands with paid employment, and give us that, and then we'll take care of our households, right? So there's a very interesting way in which women seem to be wanting things that are perhaps not so different from what men are also saying: jobs, employment, decent wages, and as opposed to being seen as this special vulnerable category that is being given this welfare scheme. So
Yeah.
I think I think that's coming through in your report as well,
Yeah.
in some way.
Exactly. And I think they did have a consciousness about, men being paid more too, right? Because I think that lifts all boats. So that was very strong, that men should, and there should be enforcement of labor laws. So very, very clear understanding, depending on where we did the field work. So I think the field work in Coimbatore, people, they were working 2 shifts, the husband and wife were working in the same mill. So there was this very strong sense of, in Kerala, they're enforcing the labor laws, whereas in Tamil Nadu, they are, undermining the interests of labor. I'll just, so Poonam, did you have a comment as well? And then I have something more on the prohibition, but I'll come back to later.
Yeah, see, actually, I'm in Pondicherry, which is a union territory. So here it is rather regarding the liquor. They have the price, the government has kept it low from the other states. And Pondicherry, since GST came to Pondicherry, previously it was under VAT, where the taxation was lower than the other states. So the business got killed. And so the government, to get income, to earn, they have made Pondicherry like a tourist spot. So big hotels, small motels, and like stay homes and guest houses are coming up. So now the thing is, for the women it is advantage here, because they get employment in these sectors. And they have the bargaining power also regarding their salary, because they will keep on switching. Whoever pays them more, they will switch over to that other place. Like household work, that very few, like household work is they are coming for household work, because they get less payment than what they will get in the hotels and all. And then also food they will be provided, because I have a friend also who runs a hotel. She all the time tells me they are changing jobs, like because it's very easy. And liquor also, so many shops have come in my street itself, like within few kilometers. Pondicherry is that, if you take, it is a 10-kilometer radius, or maybe a little more than 10 kilometers radius. And in every nook and corner, we have an eatery. So naturally, the women are working there, like washing dishes or whatever, and men also. So this is what I wanted to point out, how Pondicherry stands. Like whereas women, they have the power to bargain. Like I employ women, ladies from my house, then they are bargaining with me regarding the salary, because they will get much more if they work in a outside hotel, or the cottages, or wherever it might be, as a guest house or something. So here it is. But liquor consumption has gone up like anything, because from other nearby states and towns, they are coming for liquor, and the liquor prices purposely kept lower by the
We'll do
government.
it later,
So
not then, not
yeah,
these places.
sorry, somebody saying? Yeah. So that's all I want to say. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a complicated question. Certainly, as lawyers, we think about some of the unintended consequences of any kind of regulatory move, right? If you prohibited it, obviously, then it produces all kinds of other unintended consequences. But maybe you can. There are ways in which you can regulate it, and some of the things we mentioned in the report. If there could be safer drinking practices, and apparently there is a lot of difference between the North and the South in some of these liquor consuming practices, and where it's culturally acceptable for uh, for men and men to drink, say even at home. This was an example actually that the bureaucrats themselves told us. They said they had been looking at this for a long time, and they found that in Punjab, where you could buy a bottle and you could drink at home, men were consuming less than in Tamil Nadu, where you probably wouldn't bring it home. But, and then you consume the sachets, right? You consume far more alcohol than if you brought it home, and where the woman could then keep an eye on how much the men drank. So I think there's also messaging around, drinking practices, and so there's some role for that rather than just a blunt instrument of
prohibition.
of prohibiting. Yeah. Sorry, Divya, you wanted to follow up on this?
Yes, ma'am. I wanted to know two things, ma'am. When you said that most of the beneficiaries amongst women belong to the backward caste and most backward caste. Like, is there any kind of caste disparity in the population of the scheme amongst BC, MBC, SC, ST women, or is it just? Is there any caste disparity to it that you came across during your survey? One that. Second is how is the scheme being communicated to the women beneficiaries by the government officers? Like, communicated in the language of rights, or in the language of concession or freebies? Because the very foundation of the scheme was to tell the women that it's their right. So is it conveyed in the same language to the beneficiaries? Because the officers who handle it are mostly male, and whether they are aware of the government's motive of Dravidian Periyarist vision to the scheme, which talks about women deciding and women's autonomy and women's integrity. So is it conveyed in the same language so that we can own it up? So these are the two questions. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So I wasn't entirely sure on the caste question, because I think we found that it's reaching the most disadvantaged caste. That's what the data shows. In terms of the communication of the scheme, we actually found that because we did meet women who had a role in the local party offices and so on, and they very much spoke about it in terms of rights. And I think that is the way it's also perceived by the women. And I think it's, maybe Kalpana can add to this, but at least in the media coverage, we've seen ministers saying the same thing that the chief minister said about, the fact that it is, KMUT is for, there is a certain alignment. It may not be prominent, but nobody is departing from that line that this is actually a rights grant. And we did see it at the level of the DMK local offices, where, women were playing a big role in it. But I don't think there's any other messaging material. So when the women get the money, they attribute they register it in various ways. Sometimes it's Stalin is my brother, he's like my father, or this is like something, my parents would give me during Deepavali. I mean, so there are various registers in which they understand this scheme. But I think, yeah, there is a gap even at the local level between what the local party officers think and what the women are perceiving, because there is actually no communication material at all.
Yeah. And I think it's also, you're right, Prabha, and I think it's also the political culture of Tamil Nadu, in which the persona of the chief minister is so closely associated with the image of being this benefactor. With Jayalalitha, of course, it was Amma, right? And with Stalin, of course, the messaging is Ungaludan Stalin. So, it's sort of, it becomes this act of benevolence from above, right? No matter what the notification might say about this being essentially about your right, and this is not a dole. But I think it's that larger culture of sort of patronage in a sense also that you can't get away from, really. It's kind of saturated in the political atmosphere, so to speak. And it will need a lot of, therefore, counter efforts in the opposite direction to push it away from there and then to situate it very firmly within a language of whatever, whether it's rights and entitlements or it's a language of uh, discussions around women's unpaid care work at home. But that effort has not been done really in any significant, massive, large scale way,
Yeah.
or any sustained way, systematic way.
So I think, Kalpana, one of the questions I had is also about the DMK women's wing, right? I mean, so obviously the party is a very organized party, and it has a huge cadre of women as well working on the ground. So what is the role of and I think this is resonant for other states where although there is an increase in the number of women voters and turnout and choices and so on, the political representation by women in positions of, as elected representatives has not kept pace at all. So what is it about? I mean, is there something unique about the DMK as a party here that we can understand the role of the women's wing as probably needing to be more invested in some of these schemes, or do you have any thoughts on that?
Um, I would think, Prabha, that the DMK women's wing is, I mean, once again, there's the women's wing sort of becomes really the party's women's front, rather than being the pressure group within the party that is pushing for measures towards gender equality, right? And so I think even that consciousness that this is about claiming a greater place in the sun in terms of representation or rights for women is not necessarily something that the DMK women's wing has really imbibed. At least I see no sign of that. And it's very interesting that you should say that the DMK really, despite the presence, of course, of a few high-profile women like Tamilachi, Tangapandian and Kanimuri, it's still, when it comes to seat distribution, it is nowhere near matching either the record of Mamta in West Bengal or of Naveen Patnaik's party. Those are the parties that have done well in terms of seat allocation to women. But here we must also keep in mind that left parties have also done very woefully in this respect, right? It's not like Kerala has a better track record. It's not like the Left Democratic Front in Kerala is doing any better in terms of political representation. And really, I mean, there seems to be a very populist way in which concerns around gender equity tend to focus almost exclusively around violence and women, right? So it's really about, cracking the whip on acts of violence against women. And Stalin has done that quite effectively, that there will be, at least once again, the public messaging has been that, there will be zero tolerance sort of thing. And immediately if there's some act of violence or whatever, very uncouth language used by a DMK minister, then Kanimuri is quickly on Twitter condemning that, right? So that's really where the focus is. On what we recognize as inequality, perhaps in the more stark way than these other very persistent forms, but that don't, visibly or dramatically present themselves. So I would think so.
That's great. Thank you. That's really very valuable. So are there any other questions that people have, or suggestions or thoughts? Okay. So I think in that case, I think we will probably close this session, and I want to thank Kalpana for some really, really thoughtful comments on the report and also new lines of inquiry. This question of the gender debt burden, to put a figure on it, I think was really, really interesting, that it's 9 times the income that women might make, whereas it's only 3 times for the men. And also the question of managing the prospects of the household and the need to rescue gender from poverty, which is a very pithy formulation and really, really critical here, because I think women are thinking about it in terms of rights at a certain level, to say, our situation as women is what defines our commonality, and therefore, we should have some rights emerging from that vis-a-vis the state. So I think that's so it's really, really interesting to get all those thoughts from you. And I really thank you for engaging with the report. And thank you also to all of you for joining us today. So this recording will be available online, and we look forward to further interventions, especially as Tamil Nadu enters the election phase in a couple of weeks. I'm sure there will be more and more about the various schemes, and from the government's perspective or the party's perspective, to think of what next, right? Where could you go? Could you increase the money, or would you do something else differently? So there is an opportunity for feminists to intervene, I hope. And we've done similar work in Karnataka, which we will feature in January. And please join us then. And thank you all very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Prabha. Thank you. This fascinating conversation. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot.